Real people, real opinions, Real Talk Radio. The multi-award-winning Niall Boylan Show.
Ireland's classic hits.
Death. Yeah, now, by the way, if people have just lost somebody, I am going to suggest to you that you may deem some of the things that I'm going to talk about to be a little bit insensitive, because we'll be talking about death in a kind of bit of a flippant way. Because according to one man, Kevin Toolis, Irish, we do death really, really well. Now, he was originally raised, by the way, in Edinburgh. His parents are from Achill in County Mayo. But what does he mean by that? And how do we do it? And by the way, he's an acclaimed author, award-winning filmmaker. Kevin delves into this kind of world in his book, My Father's Wake. And he joins me on the line. Good evening to you, Kevin.
Hi, Niall. Hi.
How you doing? I was only talking about before the break about the Irish and funerals. It's only in Ireland that you hear some of the things you hear at funerals. And even I've often talked humorously about the things we say. Doesn't he look great? He's never looked as peaceful in his life. And didn't they do a great job on him? And I was only talking to him the other day. And all these little kind of isms that we have. We're strange when it comes to death, aren't we?
Well, I think the thing is that the Irish are still much more open about death than almost every other Western society. I mean, you will find in parts of Southern Europe, in Spain, even actually places in the Middle East, people will be quite open about death. But obviously you have the Anglo-Saxon way of death, and in America, where people are terrified of talking about death, that they'd be repulsed by the idea that you can see a dead body.
Because you mentioned in your book that the Anglo-Saxon thing is death is a whisper. In other words, it shouldn't be talked about.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing of all is that, you're living in Dublin, you watch Netflix, you watch the TV, etc., where you send your kids to school, etc. Very similar to the life of similar people in England. But the huge difference is that most Irish people would be seeing many dead bodies at wakes, at funeral homes in the course of their lifetime. And that is totally alien to the English way of death. I mean, most English people will only see one or two dead bodies in their entire life. And I think that is the huge and most central thing, is such a different perspective. Because if you spend a bit of time in the company of the dead, you do learn a few things, actually, even if it's just 30 minutes, you learn an awful lot about life and death, an Irish wake. And
with your own father, you kind of describe in the book about when your father's coffin was being lowered into the ground and you coming to terms with his death. And you said, I know what I had missed in failing to bind the wound of Bernard's death. I mean, what was it exactly you meant by that?
Well, my father died in a very traditional way, in a way that probably most of us won't really get to achieve. The first thing of all is, so my father's an Achill Islander. He grew up going to wakes as a child. And when he was dying of pancreatic cancer when he was 70, not that he wanted to die, but he knew how to die. He'd seen it all around him. It wasn't anything strange. He was very stoic about his dying. And when he died, he died at home. He was looked after by the family. When he died, his body was washed actually by my sister and my aunt. He was then lifted out of the bedroom. We went funeral shopping that morning. Coffin shopping. And then we had the coffin in the sitting room. So he was just moved from the bedroom into the coffin, and then the wake began. What we didn't do was we didn't sort of cry out for help. We didn't ask for the authorities. Everyone had a position, knew what they were doing. And then we had really an open celebration at that wake. So, of course, that was... I also remember my
It's amazing, by the way. It's amazing how quickly we can organise those things. It's like automatic to us, isn't it? And I mean, if you were asking me to organise an event like a birthday party or a wedding or anything like that, it takes months of organisation. But a funeral in Ireland can be organised in an afternoon, and the person will be in the ground by the following day. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure. I mean, the most important thing, I think, Niall, is that you're educating the next generation about social death. You're teaching people this is what you do when somebody dies. You go up there, you shake their hand, you look them in the eye, you say sorry for your trouble. It may sound like it's a cliche, but it's all part of that whole process of bringing on the next generation and saying, it's sad, we've lost somebody, but life goes on. And I remember on my own father's wake, so my nieces and nephews were 5 and 6, were playing around the coffin. Later on, they went home, had baked beans on toast and watched Teletubbies, and life went on. And they'd seen, the body of this old man. So it was the death in life that was so important in that event.
I mean, you experienced it differently with your brother. And I mentioned Bernard a few minutes ago, your brother who died of leukemia. And, you were a possible saviour for him because of your bone marrow, and you're a bone marrow donor. But it just, according to the book, it didn't work out or happen that way. And that death for you, you describe as a hand grenade of rage and grief. So you've experienced the other type of death as well then?
I think that was my own naivety when I was a sort of immortal 20-year-old. That's why armies always pick young men, because there's that somehow belief that the bullet will never hit you. And of course, when my brother died, and I was about 20 at the time, he was 28, had fought very hard for his life. I had 2 years of quite agonizing treatments. So when he actually died, it was this sort of shattering. I thought, oh my God, I'm mortal. And I remember, they'd taken him into a little room, as we thought, oh, it's a private room, but really it was a room because everyone knew on the hospital ward that he was dying. I remember being in that room with him, even with my father, and just feeling this sort of, powerlessness that this had happened. Bernard had fought very hard for life and died. And we were kind of like alone. I walked out of the room as a sort of mortal survivor, knowing it was like an adult. It was me and death, and there was nothing that could sort of protect you. But there is a protection. I mean, the positive thing is that in those ceremonies of the Irish wake and talking about death and socializing about death, we also sort of neutralize that fear of death, that we're not alone. We have each other, and that's the greatest comfort that you can have.
I suppose it depends on how a person dies, and in relation to Bernard, and I don't know, I wasn't obviously there on the night he passed away, but some deaths, and I've witnessed some over my years, can be quite cruel. And we see them, and it really brings a lot of sadness to us. And now, don't get me wrong, all death is sad, depending on how well you knew the person. But some deaths, you're almost willing the person to die. You're kind of saying, I wish somebody could do something to help this person just pass away, because you cannot continue to allow somebody to suffer like that. So we do we feel their pain, don't we?
Of course. I mean, there's many different ways of dying, and the way it manifests itself in our life, and the tragedy of loss of like a young person on Achill Island just a few days ago, Finbar Cafferty, it's been all the papers, young man died in Ukraine. And obviously that's a terrible loss and shock for his family. So some deaths obviously are much more cutting and poignant than others. And there's nothing much we can do about that.
And you personally would have, sorry for interrupting you, but I know, just for people who don't know, you worked as a foreign correspondent on the front line in various conflicts. So you would have been there, when death kind of ravaged through, famine-ridden Sudan and places like that. So you would have been more familiar with that type of death as well.
Sure. One of the consequences of my brother dying was I kind of went out on this huge looping journey, sort of almost like inquiring into death, asking people, really, as a journalist, it was both a privilege and a terrible curse that you could walk into someone's life and within 5 minutes say, well, what's the worst thing in life that ever happened to you? And just hear these sorts of stories. And in some warped way in my own mind, I thought, well, I'll build up these stories and be a kind of protection. But of course, it didn't really protect you.
No.
It was really at my own father's wake that I just saw the sort of community around him. I remember there's one moment, it's in the book, where the father was unconscious, been in a coma, and we thought he was very close to death. And then, began that very traditional Irish way. My aunt said, oh, well, let's do the rosary. And it was in a very small room, and the sound of the rosary was so loud. I realized really it was almost like a death lullaby, that the chorus were kind of lulling this man into death, like the way that you'd comfort a child with a familiar set of songs or something like a nursery rhyme. And there was a great act of compassion.
Yeah.
And that was that in the fact that this wasn't hidden away, the fact that this was an open death within the community. I remember there were about 10 people in that room, some of whom I hardly knew, some of whom I'd never spoken to. And of course, a bit of me was like, that's just terrible, who are they? But after a time, I thought, well, they have, of course, every right to be here because this is a death within the community, within an Irish clan.
There's so many things.
You have to learn to live with that.
There's so many things I'd love to talk to you about. Firstly, there are people I know in this country who thrive on death, who go to funerals of people who are not even related to them and dress in black, and they thrive on death. And there are those like myself, for example. I hate funerals. I don't go to graveyards. You know, my mum and dad and my brother, who died quite young at 24 years of age, he drowned in an accident. They're in graveyards. And I don't go. I don't visit them because, as far as I'm concerned, they've passed away. And I'm not a believer in God, but I'll always remember them and the effect they had on my life. But I don't need to kneel down at a stone with their name on it to remind me of that. I can think of that any time. So there are different people who represent death or appreciate death in a different way, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Sure. I think that the purpose of a ritual, though, Niall, is that you have a mechanism, a bit like a kind of software passed down from generation to generation. What do we do? What do we do at this common event? How do we teach the next generation what to do around the dead and the bereaved? And that's what I think what's so important about these open rituals is that, and I do actually think that seeing a dead body is like the best bit of bereavement.
Is that good for a kid, by the way?
Never do.
Because we talked about that in the show about 2 weeks ago. We did a topic on the show from an email from a woman whose husband's sister or something had died, and he wanted to bring the kids, to see the open casket. And she thought this was a really bad idea for children. Do you think it's a bad idea for children to see an open casket?
I think it's a great idea for children to see that. And they're actually not at all, that was certainly my experience with children, is that, they just see this as another kind of adult event. My own mother took me when I was 7 to my first wake in Achill. It was one of these old, like in an old cottage, women with scarves and old men with pipes.
I can see them now. I can actually picture the scene. Yeah, go on.
But I was so small that I couldn't actually see over the coffin. So she lifted me up. And then, the idea, like an innocent child saying prayers. So she, say a prayer for him. And then she said, she told me this. She said, touch him.
I know.
Says, I knew
touch his forehead. Touch his forehead.
Yeah. I knew straight away that this wasn't a statue. There was something strange. It wasn't. He was too still. But anyway, she said, touch him. It'll make you less afraid. And what she was doing was she was passing on that lesson from her community. This is how you cope with death to her own child.
Is that not traumatic for a child to see? Because children are innocent, I suppose. We like to protect them from the the ravages of life and the traumas of life, and then we're telling them, touch a dead body there. I don't know. Maybe we differ in that, but I don't know. I think that might be traumatic for some children.
Well, I think if it's done in a sort of context where life goes on nowadays, and then what would you like? Would you like a biscuit and a tea? And afterwards, I sat or I stood next to my mother. She was chatting to these old ladies, and I was kind of bored by these adults. But, they gave me a biscuit, and probably a soft drink, and it went on. What it is the most important thing, which is implicit in the Irish way of death, is that this is a normal event, an every other day sort of event in which life will go on. So all the talk of funerals and who died and going to this, and you look at the paper and RIP.ie, all of that is to make death. It's like pasteurize it, I think.
I'm looking at some of the text coming in, and somebody, by the way, says, remember they used to pass around plates of cigarettes at funerals. I don't remember plates of cigarettes being passed around because I would have taken a few of them. And here's another question. Somebody wants to know, and you would maybe be more familiar with this, obviously, because you were raised in Edinburgh. Well, why is it in Ireland we're keen to get them into the ground as quick as possible, but in Britain it takes 3 or 4 weeks? What's the reason? Is there a reason for that, by the way?
Well, it's a tragedy, really. The reason why it takes so long to get buried in the UK is the way that crematoriums are really controlled, and so that when you die, you can't actually get a slot for 4 or 5 weeks. And that means you can't have a wake. You couldn't obviously have the coffin, your man in the front sitting room in a coffin for 6 weeks. So it breaks up the possibility of all the community coming together. It's incredibly destructive. And it's really because these crematorium are run in the interest of the crematorium and the people who run them, rather than the interests of the grieving relatives. Surely it's much more healthy. You have this event, you have a kind of intense 3 days, you bury them, there's a bit of resolution, and you kind of move on.
We've shortened it down. So are we losing the tradition? Because we've even shortened it now because of the lack of priests, of course. Years ago, you kind of went to the mass at 5 o'clock in the evening, and the next day was the burial at 12 o'clock. So there was kind of 2 events, really. Now it's kind of narrowed down to the one because there's a shortage of priests. So we kind of do it all in the one day. So are we kind of losing the tradition a little bit?
Well, I think, it's quite common still on the island, and I'm sure amongst your listeners, and it does vary around the country along the border, but you'll have 2-day wakes or 2-night wakes. It's not uncommon.
Yeah.
I know the wake is incredibly strong in Belfast along the border, country areas, still bits of the West Coast. The enemy of the wake tends to be the funeral home, so you have more funeral homes. But I've also got something else to share, not just about the place of cigarettes. I'm sure some of your listeners will remember playing wake games.
Wake
where
games.
You play games. So when I was a teenager in Achill at the dance, and somebody says, should we go back to the wake for the crack? So at 3 o'clock in the morning, we all turn up this party of 10, slightly pissed teenagers, definitely famished and hungry, and we end up playing kind of dating games around the corpse, so there's an old game. This is all mentioned in all the books. They're very, very old. We played this game called Button, and you had a guy who kind of hid a button, a little short button, on one of the players, and you had to find out name who the player was, and if you got the name wrong, you kind of played a forfeit. So if you're a boy or a girl, you were told to go outside for 5 minutes, or you had to go and sort of tickle the back of the old man's head. You were kind of, really, it was like a really ancient thing of usurping death. It was led by a kind of burricking, a jester. And it was also sort of teaching you as a teenager, seize the moment, because they're Seamus lying there dried and desiccated, and you might be that too one day.
Yeah.
So it was like a usurping, and that's a really ancient Irish tradition too.
Yeah, they always say that a wake is the best party you'll ever be at and you'll never enjoy. But somebody texted in, by the way, says, I read this book. It's beautiful, so touching. Gave it to my friend who lost her father. It should be read by everybody. The other thing as well I want to talk about is the funny things we say. And I don't know if it's just Irish, but this kind of, this idea, and I mentioned at the start of the interview, this idea of, you say to somebody, did you hear Peter Murphy died down the road? No. I was only talking to him yesterday. It's this idea he was hardly going to tell you that he was going to die. Or when they arrive in for an open casket and, this kind of older people tend to say things like, doesn't she look marvellous? I've never seen her looking better. And these kind of Irishisms at funerals are, it's just bizarre. The things that we say. I don't know if we say them out of uncomfortableness or not, or even in the church where we all walk up in a queue to shake hands with the relatives who we probably don't even know. Most of us don't even know them. And we shake hands with them and we all say exactly the same thing. Sorry for your loss. Sorry for your loss. They know we're sorry. That's why we're all there. These kind of little traditions. Is that do we do that out of uncomfortableness? I
think I'm an optimist, and I think we do it out of a kind of compassion. I remember I wrote a poem about this, but you'd often have a coffin arriving in Knock. Knock's about 60, 70 miles away from Achill. Now, depending on how devout you were, people would go up to the airport and then, go back with a cortege, or else they'd wait somewhere, 3 or 4 miles inland, or maybe 10 miles, waiting, driving there to join the cortege, so that, when the cortege came in, there'd be a whole line of cars. Now, the one thing for certain is the woman or man in the box is never going to pay you back. They're not going to pay you for the time or the petrol expended.
No.
So it's a kind of, it is, we give of ourselves by our very presence around the dead and the bereaved, or we give nothing at all. Because you can't say, I tell you what, I won't bother doing that now. I'll just write them a check instead. It's not going to change it. You're there, that living presence, to show solidarity, that we're all part of the great mortal us. And when you stop being part of the mortal us, you're dead.
Has the increase in cremations, is it killing the tradition? Because I, for one, personally don't want a church funeral. I don't want a lot of people at it, most of whom I don't even know, and most of whom probably don't care and will never miss me. I would rather...
I'm sure you've got fans.
I would rather... myself and my wife have discussed this. Just cremate me, stick me in one of those little scatter tubes and fling me all over Cocoa Beach in Florida, one of my favourite places. So I said, that's all I want. I don't care. Is there more and more of people doing things like that, breaking from the tradition?
Well, I do think there's a terrible development. Sometimes I can understand it because it happened to my own father-in-law. But you have what they call direct cremation. You come straight out of the hospital, dying in the hospital mortuary, taken to some undertaker. Usually they farm them out, and then the relatives get a bag of ashes, and there's nothing at all. And that's an increasing thing, and obviously that's a lot cheaper. But the problem about that is, and why I think funerals and wakes are so important, is we need to have some conversations, not every day, but we need to educate ourselves in how to cope with death, social death, and also your own death. So if you don't have a ritual, it's a bit like saying to the 12-year-old, give them the keys of your BMW, say, oh, look, wee Kevin there, you just get in the car and you'll drive around by yourself, roundabouts. I'm sure in the motorway you'll find out. We teach our children driving lessons. So why can't we teach people about mortality lessons? And that's what we do in the Irish Way. It's a mortality lesson for life. This is what happens. It's all fine. You go home. It will all be okay afterwards.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the texts coming in of things that are said in the wake. Come on for the last call. Yeah. And in relation to, I suppose, the wake, it can go on forever. There's always drink involved in Ireland where we get very drunk. The most strangest experience I ever had in my life, maybe you can put this into your next book. I won't mention the nationality of the individual involved, but I was a DJ many, many years ago, just the mobile DJ type guy. And I was in my 20s and I got a phone call. Do you do, events and parties? Yeah. We're having a party in James's Street in Dublin. Can you do DJ? We'd like a lot of reggae music, please. So you can kind of guess the culture I'm talking about here. And I said, yeah.
Sure.
That's no problem at all. Yeah. And he says, yeah, we'll set up a table for you in the flat. It's a flat, right? But it was a big flat, I grant you that, okay? There was a lot of people there, about 30 or 40 people there. I arrived. They were all having a great time. They were smoking weed. They were drinking. They were all having a ball of a time. It looked like a really great party. I got paid good money. And then I was wondering why I was there. I thought it was a birthday. Some lad had died and he was stretched out on the kitchen table, right? He was on the kitchen table and they were putting cigarettes and obviously joints in his mouth and lighting them and pouring beer into his mouth. And I thought, well, if you're going to go, what better way to do it? With a reggae music and a joint in your mouth and beer being poured into your throat as well while you're at it. Those kind of traditions, I mean, are we seeing different types of traditions because Ireland is becoming a more diverse nation, or Europe is becoming more diverse, I suppose?
Yeah. I mean, obviously you have different cultures and each have their own. I've seen been at Jewish funerals where people, they do a special prayer Kaddish. The family, the eldest male, surviving male, does Kaddish. And obviously Islamic funerals have been some funerals in Gaza, usually people who've been killed by the Israelis, and have incredible sort of emotion and it's amazing sort of energy. So each, obviously, culture has a very different way of dealing with death.
Do you know what the strangest one is? Do you have any idea what... I don't know the answer to this. I'm asking you maybe because you've studied it more than I have. But do you know what the weirdest traditions are? Or the weirdest beliefs, I suppose, around the world? I see some of the ones where they kind of sail them off on little boats and set fire to them and all those kind of things. I don't know what's the strangest tradition that might be out there.
I think there's a place in it's from Micronesia, Indonesia, a place called Sulawesi, where you kind of live with the dead. You actually have them in the next door room for about 6 or 7 years, you usually do have a lot of formaldehyde, but you sort of live with your aged
corpse,
6-year-old dead grandparent, and every so often every yearly feast day they're sort of taken out and fed. Now that would be a bit of a challenge to our culture, but people do have different traditions,
yeah.
just like different religions. I think we have to. You don't have to share in them, but you have to respect.
Yeah, I wouldn't know what even the thinking behind something like that is. I suppose it's keeping their memory alive, but literally keeping them alive. Well, look, it's very interesting, and the book, I know it has got some great reviews from both The Guardian, the New York Times Book Review, and it's a powerful book, so if anybody wants to get it, it's called My Father's Wake, and it's available, I'm assuming, in all the usual outlets.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And thank you very much for having me on, and all I would say is, live long and prosper.
It sounds like an episode of Star Trek, doesn't it? Yeah.
And when it comes, maybe it's quick and swift and joyous in its own way.
Real people, real opinions, Real Talk Radio. The multi-award winning Niall Boylan Show.
Ireland's classic hits.